Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 15 of season 5 of Babylon 5 of Darkness Ascending. A battered Garibaldi stumbles into an equally battered Zoccolo, Sheridan dead with the words "You failed me" next to him, Zack asking where he was, also dead, Franklin saying they needed him just before being shot, by another Garibaldi, toting a ridiculously huge weapon. He says he did this all by himself, urging his battered self not to fight it as the surface of the counter moves up and over his arm to envelop him. He awakens in his quarters to find Lita, eyes glowing white, saying she's decided to test what the Vorlons did to her limits. She says he shouldn't have woken up and tells him this was just a dream. When he next awakes, the door to his quarters opens and he pulls a PPG on Lise, formerly Edgar's, who asks him if that's any way to treat the love of his life. Delenn takes a call from Lanier somewhat furtively in an open room. He tells her that several more attacks have occurred utterly at random, with a Centauri transmission occurring some hours before each one, but he has not been able to crack the encryption. He cannot evidence a link at this point. She confirms they need hard evidence before acting. Lanier asks if Sheridan has found out about his mission yet, and she says no, but she'll bring him in as soon as they can prove Centauri involvement. She's concerned that he's so close to the Centauri border, but they encourage one another to stay safe. Unbeknownst to Delenn, Sheridan has caught the tail end of their conversation, but remains out of sight after Delenn hurries away. Lita is working on a rep from an Earth exploration firm, trying to persuade him to use blips in large numbers on an explorer ship. Normally, Psychor would only give him one telepath at first contact, and Lita tries to sell him on the idea of using many times that number to rapidly survey a planet by virtue of being in constant contact with each other. Whilst he acknowledges there could be merit to her proposal, if he were to accept her telepaths, he would put himself in breach of the Psychor rules, and lose access to their telepaths and his insurance. He's not unsympathetic to her desire for a homeworld for telepaths, but his hands are tied. He suggests she looks for someone who isn't beholden to Psychor, and so she books an appointment with one Ambassador Jakar. Londo and Vera are discussing his calendar for the day, and aside from a curious request from Homeworld, he actually has nothing to deal with, which he finds deeply unusual. All his completely usual business with the other races has been cancelled. Vera says no one trusts each other at the moment, but Londo says that's utterly usual. He finds himself at a completely loose end, with no desire to do anything as Vera leaves him. Having allegedly used up all the hot water in Garibaldi's quarters, Lisa is trying to make tea when she discovers a half-empty bottle of alcohol, as Garibaldi complains of icicles hanging off his nose. Evening plans are rapidly put on hold. Garibaldi claims he's in control of the booze this time, Lisa pointing out how much damage it did him and them in the past. He tries to justify turning to it because of his experiences with Bester and the Mars Resistance, the lack of control leading him to want to control something. She remains angry with him, and his lack of communication over the past few months demanding he not drink while she's there. He agrees and pours the rest of the bottle away as she looks on. Lanier is working on a device to monitor tachyon transmissions in hyperspace. He has decoded only 3 words so far as he tells Captain Montoya, "Do not reply." They talk it over and agree that a ship receiving orders would be told not to reply so as not to reveal its location. Lanier, however, thinks there is another possibility, that the ship communicating with a base would do the same thing to avoid the base being exposed, as being stationary it is more vulnerable. However, he notes that comms traffic into and out of hyperspace is energy intensive and difficult, so a base would need to use a low power signal through hyperspace beacons to allow mobile units to lock onto it. Lanier believes that the more powerful burst of a transmission could allow him to lock onto the low power carrier signal and follow it back to the base. Just then, however, Montoya says they've been recalled to Babylon 5. The reason becomes obvious very shortly. Sheridan has ordered them back, and having been prepared to have it out with Delenn over the assignment of White Star 27 there, she takes the wind out of his sails by agreeing that she was wrong to do it without his agreement. Just as he was wrong not to send Lanier with his experience in the first place because he is her friend. She also has the excuse of deniability for him. He doesn't. He acknowledges that with the loss of Marcus and Naroon and others, he just wanted to protect her. Then a call comes in from Montoya, Lanier has absconded with a fighter. It seems he's going fishing as he flies through hyperspace, and of course he is, hunting for tachyons and entering a meditative state, given his likely target is too far away to make it otherwise. On the station, Lita meets with Jakar to see if a very, very old offer made back in the Gathering still stands. Her genetic material through cloning or direct mating in exchange for compensation. Whilst the shadows are gone, Jakar acknowledges that the lack of non-telepath remains a concern for them. Lita sweetens the deal with not just her DNA, but many other examples to give him the best chance of finding a sequence that is non-compatible. In return, she needs cash, deep-range exploration ships, and secrecy. Jakar thinks the last may be difficult, but she notes the ISA does not need to know about internal planetary affairs, and this could be very internal, especially given that she mentioned she recently found out that she doesn't actually have a pleasure threshold these days on her way out. Garibaldi and Lisa are at the Fresh Air restaurant. It's been a little while since we were there. He mentions that the last time he was there was with Ivanova Sinclair and Catherine Sakai, the latter he hasn't heard from in a year. Shortly after that, he was shot in the back, and he hasn't been back since. He tries to settle things down as he orders a coffee, repeatedly when offered a drink, as Lisa orders wine. Lisa asks if he's told the others about their plans for him to return to Mars to help with some things she'd noticed about Edgar's industries, but clearly he hasn't as yet. He feigns annoyance with the coffee and goes outside to augment it from a hip flask, the maitre d' noting that in future he will serve him with the special coffee. Montoya calls Sheridan again and says that even with other White Stars having joined the search, there's still no sign of Lanier. He further notes that Minbari fighters are designed to strike and return, but do carry a limited additional supply of air should they be isolated from their mothership. However, Lanier is well beyond the limits of that supply, and whilst Montoya knows he's good at meditation, he has to report that he is unlikely to survive much longer. He is indeed struggling, but his fighter is still on autopilot and warns him of an approaching ship. He struggles to form his words, telling the ship to engage full stealth and move off the beacon to let the other ship past. It is the Centauri Vorchan cruiser, one of their faster attack vessels. Lanier orders his ship to pull up alongside it and attach and sustain. It successfully does so, clamping on and drilling into its hull to replenish the fighter's air supply. Before Lanier can fully recover, the computer reports a jump point opening, and Lanier returns to normal space into the middle of what appears to be a Centauri staging area, and what may be a Centauri space station, similar to the one seen in Midnight on the firing line. On the station, Sheridan tries to comfort Delenn, but despite it having been days, she is resolute and says he's not dead until she's seen a body. Meanwhile, Londo is welcomed by Veer to a message from Centauri Prime, whose agents are coming to the realization that the other ISA members may be about to accuse the Centauri of the shipping lanes attacks by fabricating evidence. As the speaker notes, the Narn are ISA members and have access to Centauri equipment left behind when their homeworld was abandoned by the Centauri. So even if Sheridan wouldn't fabricate evidence, the Narn have motive and the ability to do so. The spokesman warns that this could be a prelude to war, and if attacked, they will strike back. In Jakar's quarters, Lita has arrived to get an update on her proposal. The response is positive, but there is a string attached. The Narn have asked that she occasionally monitor the thoughts of the other ambassadors. She looks dismayed, and after consideration decides that she has just enough decency left to reject his offer. As she turns to leave, he asks her to wait. He explains that there was no such condition. He just needed to understand how far she was willing to go. Had she agreed, there would have been no deal. As it is, the deal is on. Lanier is still leeching from the Centauri vessel as it and two other Vorchans jump into normal space and viciously ambush a group of Brakiri vessels. Lanier's fighter records the entire encounter as the slaughter unfolds. As the Vorchans prepare to jump out, he pulls a falcon and detaches to tumble amongst the floating debris, hoping to go unnoticed. So he does, and finally activates the distress beacon. His ship asks if he will be entering a meditative state, but no, he is going to watch and pray for a while instead. Montoya is heading back to the station with his precious cargo at maximum burn, with Delenn arriving just after Sheridan has been told the news. Lanier is exhausted but otherwise alive and well, and has the evidence they need. Delenn is both upset and elated all at once. Londo is passing and asks her what's wrong. She approaches him and hugs him to his immense confusion and almost fear. She says that in all the time they've known each other, they have never done that, and she fears this will be their last opportunity. She holds his hand briefly before leaving him, still deeply confused. Linnea comes on board and greets Entilzar Delenn, with Sheridan thanking him and taking the data crystal from him before he goes to rest up. Now that he has it, Sheridan almost wishes he didn't, but both he and Delenn know they just can't ignore it. So they'll brief Franklin and Garibaldi and then have a closed session of the council to announce their findings. Londo's discussing Franklin's medical database when Veer interjects to explain what's happening to Londo, that there's an ISA meeting and there weren't supposed to be any until evidence of the attackers was found, and Londo hasn't been invited. As Garibaldi catches Franklin, Londo understands just how bad things are about to become. Garibaldi returns to Lise and tells her to get out and get home as rapidly as possible because short of divine intervention, which he doesn't believe in, tomorrow they'll be at war with the Centauri. So here we are over halfway through season 5, and lo and behold, it feels like we've just landed back on the tightrope that we've been falling towards since the end of season 4. Still no sign of Lockley at the moment. This one just feels like it could have come straight out of season 2 somehow, as almost all the original cast members are in the mix here, along with Lita of course. Let's talk about her first, because her appearance in Garibaldi's quarters, assuming she was physically there of course, is fascinating, and you wonder why she picked him to practice on, particularly as she tells Jakar she wouldn't look to invade minds for personal gain. To answer my own question, she knows he's been messed with by Bester, so perhaps she was interested to have a play around and see what his mindscape now looked like. Not pretty is the short answer. I didn't actually remember the intro segment to this episode, but obviously it's signposting the path he's on. Lita didn't seem particularly bothered about that, however. Her plan to seed a new world with telepaths by getting them involved with planetary expeditions was clever, and again it's interesting that there's no suggestion of her using her powers either with a corporate rep or with Jakar. Indeed, if she had, she could have figured out Jakar's condition trap, but she seems to have wanted to keep things on the straight with him. As desperate as she is to secure a future for her people, she's clearly not prepared to sacrifice her personal boundaries to do it. Put Bester in her position, and you can imagine it would be a very different scenario. It was very lovely to have that callback to the gathering so late in the day too, yet of course it also highlighted just how far they'd both come since that point 6 years ago. Not that Jakar doesn't still have that little twinkle in his eye, of course, so it'll be interesting to see how this arrangement pans out. Linnea has an interesting role in this episode because he's in full-on dedication mode, exhibiting warrior caste cunning, whilst also staying true to his religious caste roots in wanting to pray for the dead and meditating so effectively. Montoya has a much lesser role this episode, but does give some nice tech explanation in terms of the role of a Minbari fighter. Speaking of tech, you would think the Centauri vessel would detect an atmospheric leak pretty rapidly and perhaps seal it off. The fact that Linnea stays attached to the vessel for days suggests this wasn't in fact an issue, assuming he was still on the original Vorchan. From memory, we haven't seen a huge amount of the Vorchans in action, a little against the Narn, but of course not in the Shadow War. Whilst I'm often not a fan of the speed at which the CGI moves in these later seasons, I would acknowledge here that the pack tactics of these ships and their ability to silence opposing forces so rapidly is emphasised well by the way in which they manoeuvre here. We're also of course reminded of the strength of the Minbari stealth tech, which was very effective against Earthships when active. So I do kind of buy that unless someone looks out a window, if there are any, a small Minbari fighter could go undetected as Linnea manages to. Sheridan and Delenn also feel a little more like Sheridan and Delenn here too, with Linnea being a focal point for their mutual concern, and Delenn showing just how much she'd been holding herself together despite being worried sick about him. That she then goes and hugs Londo is both wonderful, and yet also a terrifying portent of what might be to come, the significance not being lost on Londo either. She and Sheridan are aware that he may generally be innocent in terms of what's going on back home, but of course it doesn't mean he won't be impacted, and really Delenn has just tipped him off to what he's going to be facing. Rock and a hard place for her. Finally there's Garibaldi and Lise. She's seen this side of him before of course, which is why she ended up marrying Edgar's rather than him. More than that, we also discover that his days with the Alliance, like Franklin's, may soon be coming to some sort of close if he's going to work with Lise instead. In the pace of this episode, it's almost a throwaway moment, yet as he notes himself, he's very nearly the last man standing in terms of the original crew we met way back when. So in a sense he's long overdue a move, but of course parting is such sweet sorrow. I believe James's family had issues with alcohol, as did Jerry Doyle himself, so his current storyline has history etched into it beyond the character's own past. Whilst we can see why he's fallen back on it, the arrival of Lise reminds us that he does have people around him who he could have reached out to, but like Franklin, he thinks he's in control of the monster. How prescient his opening dream sequence might turn out to be, we'll have to wait and see. And it's apparent that his job is about to go a whole lot more stressful, so this does not bode well. So, by the end of this episode, it is apparent that the goal of the Babylon project is once again in peril, because the peace is about to be broken once more. Whilst it looks like everyone versus the Centauri, you've got to consider that they didn't actually fight in the Shadow War, so their military is probably at full strength. Plus, there are reports of unusual activity that Londo has seen in terms of military resource allocation, so it's unclear just how damaging this conflict could be for all concerned. I'll catch you for the next one. Cheers for now.